Well, coming to you from the Toby Family Auditorium, it's Week to Week, the political roundtable from Monday, September 10th, 2018. Welcome everyone to our program. I'm pleased to be sharing the stage tonight with three anonymous senior officials, each of whom is the lodestar in their respective organizations. Speaking of which, so last week while there was this frantic search to find who wrote the New York Times op-ed, a writer named Jess Dweck tweeted, "I'm no HR professional, but it's probably a bad sign when an employee writes an anonymous letter calling you a brain-dead jerk, and you can't even narrow it down to 100 people." I'm John Zipperer. I'm your on-the-record host for Week to Week. Now, on today's program, we are going to talk about really the bombshells that dropped last week and that are still rocking the White House. We'll also discuss the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, California polling, and more. And of course, we'll end the evening with our week-to-week live news quiz. So liberal, conservative, centrist, doesn't matter. You're all welcome at the Commonwealth Club. And so any opinions that are expressed here tonight are those solely of the speakers and not of the Commonwealth Club. Speaking of panelists, let's meet them for tonight. I'll start on the far end of the stage with Scott Shafer. He's the senior editor at the California Politics and Government Desk at KQED and a noted water polo star.
I brought my gold medal.
You can follow him on Twitter at Scott Shafer. Next to him is Dan Schnur, our returning champion from our last Week to Week program. He's a professor at the USC Annenberg School of Communications and at the UC Berkeley Institute of Governmental Studies. Also, as a noted Green Bay Packers fan, he's still gloating over their victory over the Bears last night. So, welcome back, Dan.
And towards Scott's point, a mediocre high school swimmer.
He's on Twitter at Dan Schnur. And next to me is Carla Marinucci, senior writer for the Politico California Playbook. She also recently moderated a club program with former Representative Ellen Tauscher in Marin County. And I think we'll be able to learn some more about that tonight.
Thank you.
Welcome back, Carla. She's on Twitter, by the way, at C. Marinucci. There are question cards spread around the room, I know, because I spread them out. Write out some questions, someone will collect the cards, return them up to me, and I will do my best to ask as many as possible during our hour today. Now let's move on to our roundtable. I had mentioned to our panelists on Friday that I thought last Week to Week we had kind of hit the mother lode of Trump intrigue with Paul Manafort's conviction and Michael Cohen making a plea deal. But it's kind of like the president is still working through his 10 biblical plagues. Because last week, of course, we had the bombshells from the Bob Woodward book and the anonymous New York Times op-ed. So let's discuss this. And there are people who are talking about this as a constitutional crisis moment. And there's lots of discussion about the motives and the wisdom or lack thereof of these people who have been saying that they have been undermining the president in one way or another. So actually, let's start with you, Carla, because you did interview Ellen Tauscher, and her response to this was pretty strong.
Well, yeah, and she was on the Armed Services Committee for many years as a House member. She negotiated a lot of treaties as Undersecretary of State. So her theory is that this is not one person. Anonymous is not one person. That this is sort of a group of people, perhaps in national security. My feeling is, coming at it from a press point of view, I don't know about you, Scott, but the fact that the New York Times even would publish this and say that it is a senior administration official tells me it has to be somebody very high up in the administration. And my theory was James Mattis, because I interviewed James Mattis about 6 months before he became, before the election of 2016, before he was named Secretary of State, and I asked him, what do you think of Donald Trump's views on NATO? He said he thought it was kooky. He said that he thought that our allies must think, we're out of our minds. I'm paraphrasing him, but he was very, very critical. And on the Muslim ban, he said he thought that the world would think we had basically lost our reason. He was extremely critical of Donald Trump, and most of the people I talked to when he was first nominated said, we don't think he'll take it. He really has no respect for Donald Trump. But many of those who know him say he's in that job because he feels an obligation to the country, and that's, to me, seems sort of the profile of the anonymous writer. So,
let's just work down the panel here. Dan, what are your thoughts?
I think 2 points, and I give Carla a lot of credit because there's really 2 discussions going on. One, the more frenetic and ultimately less important one, which is the guessing game, the parlor game over the identity of the individual. And second, the much more important point about the substance of the accusations. Because I can't help myself, I'll start with the parlor game. I have a friend back east, who some of you may have heard of, a political writer for many years by the name of Joe Klein. And among Joe Klein's many, many named accomplishments is, for a long time, of course, he was best known as the anonymous author of the Clintonish novel Primary Colors. And although it wasn't intended that way, it ended up being absolutely marketing genius for him. Because as he will tell you, every book he wrote after that sold far better than every book he wrote before that because of the speculation about his identity. So whoever this is, individual or collective, Carla, this person's memoirs just became a lot more valuable, whoever they are. But I'd offer this. Amongst all the fevered speculation, there was one point I read that made a lot of sense. Originally, as Carla suggested, the idea was the New York Times has sufficiently high standards that some quote-unquote senior official would be someone very, very senior, simply so they could, after the identity did become public, which it will, they could say, look at how senior this person was. But I read something just yesterday, and I thought it made a lot of sense, that as the Times was explaining the process by which they decided to print this, one of the things that their op-ed page editor said is that, of course, we check the person's credentials and reliability. And if you think about it, if it's Mike Pence or James Mattis or Nikki Haley or someone like that, you're probably not checking their resume. So just an aside like that suggests that a senior official is not misleading, but a senior official for a journalist, and I would defer to both of you guys, is a very, very broad term and could encompass dozens and dozens of people, some of whom we've heard of, many of whom we haven't. Second, very quickly, is the substance of the charges and the appropriate. And we talked in my class at Berkeley about this today, and one of my students, to his credit, drew a line between the standards of legality and morality, in which, as he pointed out correctly, are 2 very different standards. Ross Douthat wrote about this in the New York Times yesterday, just a page or 2 over from the op-ed itself. And he drew, I think, a second important distinction. He said, if you are disagreeing with the president as this individual on policy, this is a horrific breach of not just protocol, but potentially a constitutional violation. You have basically subverted the will of the American people, whether you happen to agree with the outcome of the election or not, by intentionally redirecting American government away from the wishes of the elected chief executive. And he didn't say this, but I will. And if you substitute out the name Trump for Obama or Clinton or McCain or Romney, you see the severity of what Douthat is talking about. On the other hand, he said, if this is not based on disagreement over policy, trade, diplomacy, whatever it happened to be, but based on serious doubts about the president's capability and competence, then it is a much more understandable and forgivable action. We've conflated the two, questions of both competence and policy, and I think ultimately once we do find out who this person is, and we will, the question is which of these two is the primary motivator, and I suspect that ends up directing us toward the ultimate outcome.
Scott.
I want to start by saying what a pleasure it is to be with two of my favorite people in politics, Dan Schnur and Carla Marinucci. So great to be here.
Something nice to
you.
hear.
They're much funnier than I am, so I'm going to be the straight guy, which is really ironic because I'm gay.
And funny.
And funny, as it turns out. Yeah. So, I'm going with Omarosa. She said She said today that she thought it was Mike Pence's chief of staff. I don't know if that's true, but I think it does sort of conform to what you're saying, Dan, that probably doesn't have to be somebody we all know, but somebody whose credentials should be checked out by the New York Times. So I think that check that box. It struck me as a male voice as opposed to a female. Men are much more about sort of bravado and taking credit for things than women. I think, however, that it's, if you're there to keep the country from jumping completely off the rails because you don't trust this commander-in-chief's temperament or judgment or attention span or whatever it might be, emotional intelligence, do you really want to tell everybody that you're doing that? With an op-ed piece that has, exploded the internet. Mm-hmm. So, so that draws me to the conclusion that it's really an overtly political move as opposed to something strategic. And I also think that it makes a certain amount of sense, although I'm not sure it's going to work, that let's say things fall apart for Trump, Pence becomes president, he can say through his staff, if he wants, look, we wrote this, and this is what we were trying to do, because he's tainted as well by his association and his loyalty to Trump. But we'll wait for it all to play out. We don't know, but it is incredibly. We make light of it. It's a fun parlor game, but as Alan Tauscher said, this is serious stuff. This is not normal.
Well, and Alan Tauscher used the word coup.
Yeah, she called it kind of an Ivy League coup, is what she called it.
Yeah.
But basically saying that the person must come forward. When you're making accusations and saying that basically the country has to be saved from the president.
Yeah.
But if you assume that the person, and I do, that the person is smart and or experienced enough to know how Washington works, they know that their anonymous status is temporary. I don't think anyone who would be
You're absolutely
allowed
right.
that title
Yeah.
by the New York Times would presume they could take this secret to the end of days. And so wanting 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it happens to be, of an anonymity, if for no other reason, in order to prevent Trump and his allies from engaging in personal attack, he or she must figure is worth it.
This is obviously not a one-off. It comes out as Woodward's book is coming out, and it's confirming a lot of what we've heard about in the book. I haven't read the book yet, but and others have been saying as well over the last several months. So it's the op-ed page thing. It's interesting. It's unusual. It's stunning in a lot of ways, but it doesn't really break new ground. And in some ways, it's more vague than the book. In the book, at least what I've read, is very specific in terms of what happened and when and who said what and who was in the room and all those details.
And that is, I think, the Woodward book. The president came out and tweeted today. He's called him, a loser. I can't. He insulted Bob Woodward. Basically put up a tweet of a reporter from the Washington Examiner today saying that nobody should pay attention to this book. I said, it's kind of like a karaoke singer criticizing Placido Domingo. Bob Woodward is the gold standard in our industry. He's a guy, by the way, he got me into the business. He came to San Jose State, where I was a journalism student. When I was there, he had just done the Watergate reporting. He sat around with all of us. It was an inspirational thing. It was one of the reasons I got into this business. So Bob Woodward, his credentials are impeccable. His reporting is impeccable. And that's why that book is having such an impact. When you talk about some of the incidents he mentions, Dan Coates taking papers away from the president so he won't sign them and forgetting about them, him suggesting the assassination of Bashar al-Assad. These are incredibly disturbing events, and Trump has not denied any of them, frankly. Basically, to call Bob Woodward a loser doesn't fly in Washington. Am I correct on this?
It does. You make two important points. One, it's not credible because of Woodward's reputation established over the years, and I want to come back to that in a second. As someone who has been on the receiving end and survived a Bob Woodward interview, it's an extraordinary experience. But second, your other point, Carla, is equally important. In criticizing Woodward, he's not denying many of the charges. And I will tell you this briefly, even though the interview that I was subjected to with Mr. Woodward was not nearly as high stakes as this, it's an extraordinary experience, and I will tell you, alone makes you unwilling to doubt the credibility of his work. What happens is this. He will say, let's start with the meeting that you attended on July 9th, 2004, in which the following 12 people were present. And then
you were wearing a white shirt with their red tie.
And then he will recite 11 facts, all of which are accurate, and a 12th, which makes you look like the stupidest person on the planet. And you say, oh, wait, that's not so. I was the one who argued against this, not for this. And he writes that down. And then when he meets with the next person, he says, let me ask you about the meeting you went to on July 9th. And meeting after meeting, fact after fact, along with the hundreds of I can't talk about that, along with the thousands of that's largely correct, even if in several hours of interviews there are 3, oh, that's not how it happened. I was a much smarter person than you're making it sound like. Piece by piece, little by little, he constructs a narrative. And if you've read the stories about this book, he was talking on television this morning in a very offhand way about how he had 800 pages of notes about an interview with a single individual. And so regardless of where you come down on the pro or anti-Trump matrix, it's awfully hard to argue the substance.
It's interesting that people in Washington are so willing to talk to him.
Mm-hmm.
It's great. I mean,
it's ego. Bob Woodward wants to talk to me. I can handle it. I mean, and then you've heard the old joke that the way that people in Washington read a book is to look at the index first to see if they're in it.
Did you do that?
Oh yeah. But all jokes aside, the way it's done, and both of you can talk this better than me because this is not the way you've approached things, but you've seen it as I have, is to call it be a source or be a target. And I say this, I'm not criticizing Mr. Woodward at all. He's an extraordinary journalist and he does incredible work. But it is fairly clear when you read his books who has cooperated with him and who has not. And say what you will about Donald Trump's judgment, his frantic and belated phone call to Woodward trying to get into the book was probably the smart thing to do.
Let's talk a bit more about that because the Washington Post, printed a transcript of this phone call of the president to Bob Woodward. A fair amount of that call seemed to involve Trump saying, "You never asked me to be in it."
That's right.
And Bob Woodward saying, "No, I did."
I asked you multiple times.
What did you think of that call? Is that common in the journalistic world? Does Governor Brown call you up, Scott, and say?
Well, I mean, there's a book coming out this week, and in fact, I think I'm interviewing somebody. No, I'm not doing it here, but it's her name is Miriam Pavel. Thank you. Yeah. And she previously had done a book about Cesar Chavez, but she did one about the Browns of California. That's the name of it, and it tells the story of California through the lives of the various people in Jerry Brown and Pat Brown's family. And I was up, talking to the governor a few weeks ago about something, and he had just gone through like every line of that book. And it was actually more than a few weeks ago, it was a few months ago. So he clearly pays very close attention. I think they also try to prevent bad things from happening. Like there was somebody in the newsroom today doing a story about his pardons that he's done and commuting of sentences of violent criminals. And they were just in the emails, they were like very precise about, well, make sure you do this, or make sure you don't forget this, or you shouldn't say this, or talk to this person. So they're very thorough in that way. But and I'm sure I think politicians in those offices they have to save those calls for a really good reason, because if you do it every day, it's like, oh, there's Schnurr again.
Well, this one goes to Kellyanne Conway, and her. I mean, she apparently never asked him directly. She pretty much admitted that. I believe it was Chris Matthews today, or with one of the interviews I saw her with today. And I think that, as somebody who's done this work, I mean, don't you go right to the subject and say, do you want to do this or not? She shielded him from it or just blew it off, essentially.
I think we're getting a little bit further down in the weeds from where John started our conversation, but I would say this quickly to that. Kellyanne Conway telling an interviewer that she never brought it up with Donald Trump does not necessarily mean that she never brought it up with Donald Trump. And I don't say, and I'm not saying that as criticism. If you are a staff person if you're a staff person for an elected official, there's an extraordinary temptation and pressure to take a hit for your boss's mistake. And if Kellyanne Conway, and I have no idea if she did or not, did go to the president and say, they call it be a source or be a target, Mr. President, I think you ought to talk to him, and he said no, it's, while I wouldn't defend it, it is understandable why she would take that hit on her own.
Did Bush and Obama talk to Woodward for the books he did on their administrations?
Bush and Obama both did.
They both did?
Yeah.
Okay.
Today, President Trump threatened to write his own book about his presidency. Dan, I assume that was frustration speaking, but do you think he's more frustrated about the people, talking smack about him and publishing the stuff against him, or that is he more frustrated over the lack of people effectively defending him? I'm asking you to read his mind, I understand, but I mean, what do you think?
I don't know that you can distinguish between the two. Everything that you've read, whether from Woodward or Omarosa or anyone else in between, is that this is a man with an extraordinary temper. And I think pinpointing the primary source of his anger versus the secondary and tertiary source is above my pay grade.
Okay.
Last time he wrote a book, his ghostwriter turned on him.
Yeah, The Art of the Deal, that's right.
You may not want to do that again.
Coloring person.
What's interesting here is to watch where some of the polls have gone on Donald Trump, even in the last couple of days.
Yeah.
We're now seeing independents overwhelmingly saying that he has no credibility with them.
I think
now I believe
31% with independents.
That's right. Now the number of Republicans has jumped on that one too. I think 18% now. And of course, Democrats are 92%, which is unbelieving.
Which is extraordinary given the economy, because the economy really is going gangbusters.
But this is an area where Obama this week also made a case. If the economy is in such great shape, he doesn't get all the credit for it, and challenging him on that. Just today, he put out a tweet saying that for the first time in 100 years, the GDP is higher than the unemployment rate, which is a complete lie. It's just not true.
Historically,
and was challenged on it.
Historically, voters generally start to give a president credit or blame for the economy a little bit after they've been in office for a little bit more than a year. So again, taking all the uniqueness out of this current situation, we're past the point where an incumbent president would now be getting more credit than his predecessor. But what's interesting about those poll numbers, Carla, is why they're going down. In 2016, voters who said that change in Washington was the most important factor in their vote voted for Donald Trump by an 81-14 margin. And that number has gradually gone down, and it is now, I believe for the first time, you guys would know better than me, for the first time underwater. In other words, more voters do not see him as a credible agent of change than as one. And if that was his meal ticket that got him there originally, all the rest of this aside, if people don't see him as someone, giving it back to all those damn politicians.
And if he were a master politician, wouldn't he use this to turn and say, this is why you haven't seen me as change, I've been undercut by the deep state. Instead, it's become a witch hunt within the administration to try to find, as always, the leaker.
Well, the writer of that op-ed said it's not the deep state, it's the steady state. It's pretty much everybody in the executive office and the Oval Office and so on.
Maybe it's Melania.
There was a funny picture of Michelle Obama on the couch, all curled up, writing. It's like, here's your op-ed.
I didn't see that.
Yes.
We obviously had a number of questions on this. I'll just put them all together because we'll need to move on soon. But do you think the death of John McCain triggered the conscience of the anonymous writer?
Wow, I mean, to me, I watched the services, and as somebody who covered John McCain and spent a lot of time with him on the Straight Talk Express, I there's no explaining that experience as a political writer was probably one of the great experiences I've ever had in terms of being with a candidate who just for hours spoke his mind, sometimes got in trouble doing it, and yet was not afraid to sit with reporters and actually debate. It was like being in a master political science class. And you watched that funeral and felt like you were watching a memorial for the death of civility in politics.
Yeah, on the other hand, and Dan will obviously weigh in. He worked for John McCain a bit, but how quickly that dissipated. The first day of business was Tuesday, and the Kavanaugh hearings, and it just evaporated so quickly. To your question, John, my guess is that this has been in the works for quite a while, and that it took time to vet. And so I don't think, if you can work for a guy who said, I don't like people that get captured, I like winners, in reference to McCain. If that didn't bother you, I don't think his dying is really going to, suddenly turn your conscience on.
Yeah, I agree that to watch how quickly that spirit just dissipated was shocking.
Yeah.
Someone else wrote, Anonymous tells us nothing we did not already know. Someone suggests that the White House orchestrated Anonymous to that editorial to deflect attention.
That is one theory out there.
John, I'd offer you this. Anonymous might not have told us anything that we didn't know or didn't suspect, but once again, this comes back to the importance of a source's biography and credibility, even without a name. If Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders or John Kasich or Ben Sasse had said all those things, it would have been an interesting story, and then we would have gone on to talking about Colin Kaepernick like we're supposed to.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But because this was someone who was employed at a senior level in the White House, the most important part of that op-ed was not the content, but the author, even if the author's identity isn't known.
Well, and someone did write, which one of you wrote the op-ed? Okay, well, let's move on to the other big news last week, which was the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court nomination hearings, or confirmation hearings, excuse me. They were quite something. We've seen some raucous hearings in the past, but this had protesters, it had quite a bit of arguing among the committee, accusations of it being a sham, etc. Carla, while you're watching this, what stood out to you? Did we learn anything out of all of that?
I think one thing that stood out was the definite contrast between Senator Kamala Harris and Senator Dianne Feinstein. Watching these two women up there, Kamala Harris, boy, came out of the box just, punching. And she just got a tremendous amount of national attention. She did herself a big favor on the 2020 front by just getting so much attention on her style, her aggressiveness. In some respects, she lost ground in making sort of an unfair accusation against Kavanaugh, saying that he had talked about birth control as an abortion-inducing drug. In fact, he was quoting somebody else. That PolitiFact challenged her on that today. But Senator Feinstein took a lot of heat from Kevin De Leon, who's running against her, basically saying she was too deferential, wasn't aggressive enough. She got criticism from a lot of the progressives out there, but at the same time, she held her own and did what Dianne Feinstein does best, which is goes right to the heart of the matter, gets information, talk to him about Roe v. Wade. The fact is, this is kind of a done deal, but boy, I thought it was interesting that Kavanaugh had Condoleezza Rice sitting right behind him and endorsing him. That was sort of a very powerful thing. And Lisa Blatt, who was a clerk for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a very liberal woman, liberal attorney. That endorsing him as well. Those were smart moves on their part.
Carla, if you have another minute, you should tell them. David Siders, my second favorite California-based political reporter, wrote a phenomenal piece about Harris and Cory Booker, and you're probably better.
Yeah. I mean, Booker also. I mean, that moment was what a drama where he
briefly explain.
Basically, the Republicans the night before the hearing released 42,000 pages of documents. The Democrats complained that many of them were redacted, that these should be released to the public, that they didn't have enough time to review them. And Senator Feinstein said from the beginning she wanted to look at 1 million documents related to Kavanaugh's tenure in the Bush White House. So Booker, there were a lot of complaints that the Democrats were just laying down and taking this and should have either walked out, boycotted, or released these documents to the public. And Booker did that in the end in a very dramatic moment. A lot of people said this was aimed at his 2020 audience. So between these two, between Kamala Harris and Booker, we saw sort of a glimpse of what's ahead.
I think both of them, though, in the end, it was sort of much ado about nothing. With Kamala, there was like 8 or 10 minutes of cross-examining Kavanaugh about, did you have a conversation with somebody in this law firm that was started by Trump's personal attorney? I think she said, I think you know somebody, but you don't want to say who it is. And it was all this drama. And then it turned out he came back after lunch and said, no, I didn't. And I think it just... I don't know why he didn't just say that the first time, but it just kind of let the steam out of it. But I think for Kamala Harris, what I thought came through was her ability. I mean, she obviously has a prosecutorial style, which is kind of a political Rorschach test. I mean, some people like it and some people really are put off by it. But I think she showed that she can ask questions that others didn't come up with. She asked him, for example, can you think of another law on the books, federal law, that has anything to do with male health? Anything that tells men what they can do with their own health. And of course, he had
their own bodies, right?
Yeah. And it was like 5 seconds of it. So I think that was her strength, is the ability to do that. And you're right, Carla. I mean, she certainly, if it's about name ID, she got the big boost.
The other thing in the Siders piece on Politico, that's www.politico.com.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Is and I say this not defending either the nominee or the president, taking sides in either direction. But David, who's a fine reporter, came to another conclusion about Harris and Booker's moments. The fact that Kavanaugh had not talked about it with someone from that law firm. The fact that the documents that Booker was demanding had already been released didn't matter. And what David wrote is a potential legacy of the Trump era, even when it's passed, is presidential candidates of both parties now understand that if they make loud accusatory noises, even if they can't back them up, it will accrue to their political benefit. Right. And I say that not to take sides on either, but one of the things I've struggled with as somebody who teaches political communications for the past few years, and we're very honest with our students about this, is Donald Trump an aberration? Does he communicate with the public in a fundamentally different way than most people, and when he's gone, we'll go back to a pre-Trump normal? Or is he a forerunner? Mm-hmm. That will candidates in the future of both parties and all ideologies employ many of these techniques when they develop and target and deliver their messages? And the lesson that I took from David's piece is it's the latter, and regardless of where you come down on the political spectrum, that's a disquieting prospect.
Liberal activists in Maine have told GOP Senator Susan Collins that she needs to vote against Kavanaugh, or they're going to give I guess they've raised nearly $900,000, and they would give that to her opponent. Isn't that literally vote buying? I mean, specific vote, or this money goes elsewhere.
The Maine papers had a full-page ad addressing her today. She's been sent 3,000 coat hangers by anti...
She has a lot of coats.
By pro-choice activists trying to get that message to her. It doesn't seem to me that she's going to change her mind on this one.
No.
I mean she's getting too much heat from
I think...
if I just can really quick.
You think she will vote against?
No, I think she will vote for his confirmation.
Yeah. And I'll say this. I say this as a supporter of Roe v. Wade. I don't know that that does us any good in terms of the political dialogue, or does us any good as a society to mail coat hangers to a United States senator or to express your position on the issue of reproductive rights. And that, to me, whether it's the point that Siders was making in this piece or more broadly, gets to the broader question. And we've talked about this when I've been privileged to visit with all of you before. to me, much more interesting and in the long run more important than what is Trump is why is Trump? What is it on the landscape in our environment, in our society, that has produced such a fundamentally different way of communicating our thoughts? And those coat hangers, albeit on the other side of the discussion, to me underscore that point in an uncomfortable way.
Before we move on from that section, I was wondering if you think that these senators who are putting themselves out there as pretty clearly, 2020 candidates, I would throw in Earl. I would throw in Elizabeth Warren, who this past week said that it's time to invoke the 25th Amendment. But do you think, let's stick with California because we're Californians here, do you think Senator Harris risks any blowback from voters on, you're not doing your job, you're running for president?
No.
And you're saying no right away.
Yeah, I mean, the half-life for these kinds of things is pretty short. I think people will remember, oh, she did something and she kind of took him on, but I don't think the specifics of it. I mean, I think the impact it's going to have is more immediate, like Carla said. I mean, she probably raised a boatload of money. At Cory Booker, I got an email from Cory Booker, please sign my petition. I mean, they were immediately trying to cash in on that. But, I think the race in 2020 is going to be so wide open that I'm not sure we can even imagine who could be the nominee. I mean, I really feel it's a year when you could, somebody, like Steve Bullock, the governor of Montana, or Seth Moulton, I mean, not literally him, but somebody that, we're not really thinking about.
Somebody Moulton-esque.
But we do have two Californians this week who are in Ohio. Eric Garcetti.
Eric Garcetti.
Yeah, Eric Garcetti's doing a bunch of things in Ohio, and Kamala Harris is addressing keynoting a very big Democratic fundraiser there. And we should add Michael Avenatti, who's a Newport Beach lawyer. Excuse me.
Eric Garcetti. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I mean, he's running too. We've got Tom Steyer, who hasn't said he's running, but he's amassing this huge list of people who are, in support of impeachment. And you've got to wonder what his thing. And then there's Eric Swalwell over from the East Bay. You got a crowd of people from California, and all of them are very good at social media, and all of them have gotten a lot of national attention. So we'll see how.
Well, if you think
Eric Garcetti, to date, I will tell you, has without any doubt the best soundbite of the 2020 presidential campaign. The mayor of Los Angeles goes to rural South Carolina and tells the audience, in Los Angeles, we're just like you, we just have more Kardashians.
He's kind of a sleeper. I think he is funny.
I think he's a sleeper too.
Yeah, he's one of these guys in politics who's comfortable in his own skin. You talk to him and he seems like a normal guy, which there's a lot of abnormal people in politics. We'll see. And gives a good speech. I've seen him at the Democratic convention.
Yeah,
so
we talked about this before, but first Jewish mayor of Los Angeles, plus Mexican American, speaks fluent Spanish, plus he's Italian.
And just corner everything.
And he
plays the piano.
Accomplished jazz musician.
Yes.
So
he writes code for
and writes code.
Also.
I mean, he's
and he co-founded Black Lives Matter. I mean, this guy is amazing. Well, I brought it up just because, again, we're giving a lot of love to Politico today. There was an article on Politico about my home state, Wisconsin. They have a gubernatorial race there. Incumbent Scott Walker is running for re-election. This would be his third term. Scott Walker, very conservative, and he's actually behind in the race right now. And one of the things he's getting flack for on the trail, the campaign trail, is his 2016 run for president. And it's the old, you should have been here minding the store, not off in, Iowa.
It is true, and people have written about this. Historically in California, we don't like people to run for president. Ask Jerry Brown, right?
Yeah.
So it's a dangerous thing.
I think a presidential campaign at the state level is more of an intensifier of existing feelings than it is something that's going to change their feelings about someone. If you like someone, you're excited that they ran, even if they came up a little bit short. If you don't like them, this gives you one more thing to not like about them. Scott Walker, and like John, Wisconsin is my home state. Scott Walker's running for his third term as governor, and he's facing an uphill fight for all sorts of reasons. Yeah. The fact that he ran for president is an additional talking point. I don't know that anyone said, boy, I really like the school vouchers and the tax cuts and all the rest of it, but he ran for president, so forget it. I want to get rid of him.
He barely ran for a day and a half anyway. He wasn't even in it that long.
Blink and you miss it.
And then they should give him credit for knowing when to get out.
Yeah, yeah. That's something Jerry Brown didn't know in 1980.
Well, let's move on to another topic, and that is bail reform. So in October 2019, a new law will take effect that pretty much ends money bail in California's criminal justice system. Some of that bill's early supporters, however, you could say they bailed on bail reform. They came to oppose that bill because they thought it gave judges too much power to determine who could be held in preventive detention. Scott, can you give us some of the genesis of why did this impetus for bail reform start in the first place?
Sure. Well, there's been like a national conversation about criminal justice reform generally, and it's been somewhat bipartisan. Seems to be, stuck in neutral right now. But California has enacted numerous, both at the ballot box and through the legislature, important reforms. Prop 47, which lowered the penalty from felony to misdemeanor for a lot of drug crimes. Prop 57, which is enabling more people to get out of prison earlier. Governor Brown has released a record number of people recommended for parole. He hasn't reversed them. Gray Davis reversed almost every single one. Jerry Brown has let hundreds of them go forward. And so bail is something that's been with us for decades and decades and decades. And it's become more clear to people that studied it that money should not be the criteria for whether somebody is allowed to get out of custody, while they're awaiting trial, and that's exactly what it is. If you can't afford it, if you're a low-income person, and a lot of people accused of crimes are, you're stuck in jail, for a long time. And so, people, including the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, Tani Cantil-Sacaawe, came on board and said, we've got to study this. And she appointed a very diverse group of judges and prosecutors, defense attorneys from all over the state, and they all came to the same conclusion, which was we really need to get rid of this system and replace it with something that is more fair and less based on what your ability to pay for your freedom. Problem is, almost before the ink was dry on the signature, that when the governor signed it, there was the bail industry immediately took out papers to try to put it on the ballot with a referendum. So it's supposed to take effect in October of next year, but it could be on the ballot in 2020 if they get enough signatures. That'll postpone it.
Yeah, because this essentially does away with the bail industry.
Yeah.
There's
it would just
150, of these companies here in California alone, and there was a big effort on the other side. They faced but a lobbying effort as well.
Yeah, and so what they want to replace it with is a risk assessment. So the judges will use an algorithm to study the person's past and their situation. Are they a flight risk? Are they a danger to public safety? And the civil libertarian types don't like it because now they're afraid the judges are going to have more authority to keep people in jail. But what's interesting, and hasn't really come up, is that Jerry Brown has really diversified the judiciary in California. He is appointed as judge, and he's appointed hundreds and hundreds of judges, public defenders, defense attorneys. You would never see that from Arnold Schwarzenegger, Gray Davis, Pete Wilson, I'm sure. So you've got not only more women, more people of color from different kinds of backgrounds, but you have, attorneys, former attorneys, and folks that come from the defense side of the courtroom. And I think that, could make a difference too in how they see these cases.
Scott made a really important point in passing that's worth going back to, www.kqed. And that is that rather than looking at this bail debate as a standalone issue, look at it in the context of parole reform and mental health counseling for prisoners, the severity that an accomplice to a first-degree murder can be charged with. Now the question about whether a teen who commits an atrocious, violent crime can be charged as an adult. And so what you've seen over the last several years here is when Carla and I were coming up in California politics, Scott was already a grand old man at that point. Crime was the defining issue. Yeah. And you mentioned Gray Davis. And I think very highly of former Governor Davis, but he knew he could not get elected governor as a Democrat in California if he was not as tough on crime as George Deukmejian and Pete Wilson combined, which is pretty tough on crime. And over the last several years, primarily with some of the parole reform measures that Governor Brown has supported and signed into law, you've seen a really pronounced move in the other direction. And while I'm lousy at predictions, I gave them up in November of 2016 forever, I'd suggest that on an issue like this one, it's cyclical. And during Governor Brown's first 2 terms in office, we saw similar trending. And regardless of whether you think it was the right thing or the wrong thing, an appropriate correction or an overcorrection, by the time Jerry Brown left office in 1983, the public had shifted dramatically into a tough on crime mode, which maintained for about the next 15 to 20 years. And unlike some issues, I would point to an issue like marriage equality, where I don't think there is a cycle, but rather just a singular trajectory. On issues like crime in the community, there's a cycle, and it's going to be interesting to me once this next round of reforms is debated, how much longer this trending continues before we see an early 80s, 90s, 3 strikes and you're out type of a reaction to this.
Well, and as you remember well, because you were there, when Polly Klaas was kidnapped and murdered, that launched, along with another murder in Fresno, the 3 strikes, very tough 3 strikes ballot measure, which passed and has since been reformed by the voters. But Dan's totally right, and I think there's also, as crime and feelings about crime is cyclical, I think it tracks with the economy in a certain way. When the economy is good, people are feeling better about their own personal situation. I think maybe they feel a little bit more generous about giving people second chances and that kind of thing. The exception to that, I would say, is about drugs. I mean, I do feel like there's more of a consensus now in California and elsewhere that, it doesn't make any sense to lock somebody up for a very long time for selling pot or crack cocaine more than powder, those sorts of things. And so I think there is some consensus along those lines. But, but what's interesting too is that Jerry Brown, like you said, Dan, I mean, I think he feels like this is his chance to correct some mistakes that were made or unforeseen consequences of bills that he signed when he was governor, the determinate sentencing law in particular that took discretion away from judges. And so I think he sees this as really unusual and a gift to be able to go back and fix some of the things that you feel you broke when you were governor.
I think to his legacy issues. I mean, we're now seeing the last days of Jerry Brown's governorship, and there's going to be big shoes to fill. But also, he's done things like the bail measure. This bail bill was watched around the country. This was a landmark piece of legislation, and that climate change. Jerry Brown's, kind of rushing to get a lot of this done. We saw him.
Yeah. And this is to me the fascinating thing about the governor right now. As many of you remember, during his first 2 terms in office, he treated his father very poorly, both personally and politically. Went to great lengths to distance himself from his father and his legacy. And I would call it the wisdom of years. He's realized that was not the appropriate tack to take. And I think he recognizes, even though he despises the term legacy, that his father is still remembered because of the highway system, because of the UC system, because of the water, the water and other infrastructure things that he took on. And for this governor, it must be incredibly frustrating, because the most impactful thing he has done is the way he's addressed the state's finances. And somewhere in his head, he has to know they don't build statues to somebody who balances the budget and has a rainy day fund. And so here he sits with a high-speed rail that may or may not be finished, with a California water fix that may or may not be finished, and with weeks left in his time in office. The question is, how is this Brown going to be remembered? And as admirable as he is in many ways, he wouldn't be human if that weren't gnawing at him.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's kind of stay with California politics there, because in July, the San Francisco Chronicle reported that gubernatorial candidate Gavin Newsom and Senator Dianne Feinstein each had double-digit leads over their challengers, Republican John Cox and Democrat Kevin DeLeon, respectively. Last week, a new poll from, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Probolsky Research showed that both of these leads were single digits. Scott, what did you think of that? How reliable is this poll?
You know, that firm is identified, I think, with Republican candidates and causes.
Yes.
You know, to me in California, there's 3 gold standard polls. There's the LA Times, USC poll. There's what used to be the Field poll, is now the Berkeley IGS poll, and there's PPIC. I mean, they do really, you know, they know how to do it accurately, and they've done it for decades, and I think you can trust them. Anytime a poll comes out of a campaign or somebody who's campaign oriented, you have to be very suspicious. And I just don't see anything that's happened in the last 3 months to make that suddenly a single digit race. I mean, there hasn't been anything. I think the last poll showed he was up 28.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So
I mean, I'm
they
not
shopped
sure,
it around.
Yeah, I'm not sure many voters still know who John Cox is.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe in Illinois they do, because he ran for Senate twice and for president there.
Right.
But he's gone after Newsom in some respects. I think it's been kind of smart, going after him as a privileged, favored son kind of candidate, somebody who has been helped a lot by his rich patrons, and he's sort of cast himself as a friend of the common man, going to the DMV. He is a multimillionaire developer.
Plus the DMV in Ross is not that busy.
Yeah. So it's going to be interesting. They have one debate scheduled on October 1st, I think it is. That one's going to be kind of interesting.
CNN, yeah. Well, and then there's like building sort of grassroots pressure for him to do at least 1 or 2 more, which I don't think will matter. I mean, I think, Dan, you may differ, but there's a long line of either governors or candidates who are way ahead and never debated, Dianne Feinstein among them.
If Gavin Newsom were to debate John Cox at halftime of an LA Rams San Francisco 49ers game, he would be very much in keeping with the way frontrunners tend to approach these things. California political history.
Yeah.
Look, Probolsky is a partisan, but he is a fairly respected pollster. And while he polls for one side of the aisle much more than the other, he generally tends to be at least in the ballpark, if not precise. What's interesting to me about these numbers, and I have no idea if they're accurate or not, is it didn't show support for Cox and for DeLeon building as much as it showed a significantly higher undecided.
Yeah.
And depending on how you ask a question and how you frame a poll, people who don't pay a lot of attention to politics can either be encouraged to choose even if they don't have strong feelings, or just let to have a no opinion. And so John Cox or Kevin DeLeon can challenge no opinion to a debate. No opinion will decline, and you go on from there.
It is. I would just say, though, it is interesting, and this is not just that poll, but a number of polls. Although Dianne Feinstein, I think she won every county, when she was on the ballot in June, including DeLeon's L.A. She hasn't really broken 46 or 7. Now, you might say, well, that's fine, but there is a large number of undecideds in that race. And while they may come home to Feinstein ultimately, they're not. It's hard to imagine they're undecided about her.
That's an interesting question, though. With 2 Democrats running in the race, what does coming home mean for an undecided voter?
Well, it could be Republicans, I guess. I haven't looked at the cross.
Well, I mean, the PPIC poll said that 48% of the Republicans said they were just going to sit the race out, which I think that's fascinating, too.
Well, it was interesting. Early on, DeLeon was doing quite well with Republican voters. And he's like the sanctuary state author. And
I think he is in the Probolsky poll, too, which is,
well, that's more understandable. If you a low-information voter knows who Dianne Feinstein is and doesn't know who Kevin DeLeon is.
Yeah.
And if you're a lifelong Republican, you might know that Feinstein is a centrist, but you still know that she's in the other party. You don't know who this
go with the double. You don't know.
But to Carla's point about the number of Republicans sitting out, there's actually a considerable amount of academic research on this as a result of the top 2 primary. When a lot of well-meaning would-be reformers like me pushed for the top 2 primary several years ago, we had thought, for some reason, that when there was a congressional or legislative race in which both candidates were of the same party in a general election, that the voters of the unrepresented party, either Republicans in San Francisco or Democrats in Southern Orange County, would say, there are two candidates from the other party in this election. Perhaps I should pay even more attention to this race than I normally do and pick the one that is nominally closer to the political center than the other. That's not so much what happened. What generally happens when voters, Democrat or Republican, see a ballot with two candidates from the other party on it, they just don't vote. And so while I think the top two primaries is a good idea, still think it's a good idea for many reasons, the original impetus that many of us had for it has been proven to be totally, truly, madly, deeply, tragically, embarrassingly wrong. Thank you. Next question.
And because of the system we have in California, it can only change
and considering that most of the down ballot races, lieutenant governor and so forth, are Democrat versus Democrat. I mean, so Republicans are going to be sitting out a lot of these races, which is sad.
That's why they have the gas tax.
Yeah.
Well, and today, speaking of kind of legacy issues, Governor Jerry Brown signed a bill to commit California to using 100% renewable energy sources by 2045. That bill was authored by Kevin De Leon.
That's
Do you
right.
think that will help?
Yeah, I mean, Kevin De Leon was right there with the governor. He's right in the middle of the photo op, and I mean, his challenge is to get himself known to voters out there in California. Still, he's been very aggressive attacking Senator Feinstein, as we mentioned. But on this issue of climate change, and we're going into a week where Governor Brown is going to be welcoming in as of Wednesday. World leaders, people from around the country, Michael Bloomberg, John Kerry, a number of other people coming to town, and using this climate change issue to talk about. This was an issue today. He not only signed the bill, but an executive order that again puts California in the forefront and is another pushback to the Trump administration on this very important issue. So yeah, Kevin De Leon was the author there, and that's got to help him with environmentalists, but whether that pushes him ahead of Feinstein.
It was funny because when he signed, the governor signed it, and he was handing pens. He handed a pen to De Leon. He handed one, I think, to Lena Gonzalez, and then he said, "Well, we ought to give something to Steyer." So they gave him something. But when De Leon knew he needed to get a photo, for the TV ads or whatever, so he held up the bill and then reached out to shake the governor's hand, thinking that's the photo, right? And the governor, you could tell he did not want any part of this photo. So he's like looking away, looking down, wasn't smiling, he's pretty close to Dianne Feinstein. So. And it was funny. It was just a funny little moment there.
I would say with Donald Trump.
I would say this. I'm wary, and certainly not opposed, not by any stretch of the imagination, but wary of any legislation with an implementation date 28 years in the future. So the political impact is exactly as you described, but when I began thinking about where I would be and what I would be doing in the year 2045, I just got profoundly depressed. And so,
let's try to get through a few more questions from the audience before we go to the news quiz. Someone writes, why not focus on the DOJ and FBI being weaponized? It is far more serious than electing the wrong man for president. I assume that could be directed at a number of different people, either journalists or the anonymous writers and such.
Yeah, I mean, we still have the impact of the Mueller investigation and where that's going, and this is where everything we're talking about this week, it could be just blown up by what's going to drop on this, and I have to think. I mean, from all the sources that we've talked to, and our own reporting at Politico, the president is just stressing about this, and this is we've talked about the shiny object that we all follow in the media this week, that week, the tweet and so forth. Is the business of the government getting done? We still have these children separated from their parents. That's gone out of the news. Nobody's really watching a lot of the really important stuff.
It's so true, and I think the weaponizing of the DOJ is. I think the question a lot of people have is, okay, when Trump leaves, is it going to go back to normal? Or have some things been broken? Have some institutions been broken? He's attacked the CIA, the FBI, the Department of Justice, the media, the courts, and you just wonder at some point, how badly does it need to be broken, and does the faith in those institutions have to be diminished before
because he has
it can be hard to
essentially
put it
asked
back
the
together?
DOJ to investigate who is anonymous. Right?
Yeah.
And I think the large question, I'm an optimist, so I believe anything can be fixed, this included. But I think to a large degree, this is where the outcome of the Mueller investigation becomes so important. Mueller clearly does not care about headlines or media coverage, so it's easier for us to look past him because he's not seeking public attention. Of course, he's preparing. He's in the middle of a legal endeavor, and impeachment, as we've talked about here before, is not a legal endeavor, it's a political question. So to me, the overriding challenge for Mueller is will he produce such an overwhelming amount of evidence that the legal impact drives the politics instead of the politics withstanding the legal? And if the answer is yes, that his findings and his presentation ultimately drives the political process, whether towards impeachment or some other type of remedy, then I think the sort of corrective action that you're asking about, Scott, does happen.
Yeah.
If Mueller's conclusions don't have sufficient power to drive that political conclusion, then I think the fix becomes harder.
You know, just a quick story. I was in Croatia a few weeks ago and watching a water polo game, that was a whole crazy experience. But behind me was somebody from the UN who grew up in Dubrovnik and had moved to New York, and he was now assigned to Sarajevo, and we were just chatting about the situation in Croatia after all these wars in the 90s and also the situation here. He said, you know, the thing that ushered in the breakup of Yugoslavia was that each of these regions had their own news services and their own source of facts. And, you know, not to say that we're going to become the next Yugoslavia, but it is clearly important, I think, that you've got these news operations that segments of the population trust, whether or not they're accurate. And I think that is an ongoing problem potentially that, you say it can be fixed, but, I do think that that's a bit of a cancer on our system.
It's interesting you bring that up because there was a question I'm not going to actually raise for discussion because we're out of time, but it was actually saying if you watch Fox News, they're laying out the intelligent reasons for supporting Donald Trump's policies and the reasons behind them. Are they the fake news, or should people be paying more attention to that who don't necessarily agree? And
I think people should all turn off all the cable stations, personally.
Every breakthrough in communications technology, going back to the printing press, has led to this kind of populist empowerment and sort of information balkanization. It happens faster now because of the technology, but this isn't new. Many of you have heard me quote Mark Twain before. It's become my favorite quote over the last 20 months or so, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. History isn't quite repeating itself, and it's moving faster because of the technology. Mm-hmm. But whenever a society has to grapple with a new and more populist empowered form of communications, this is what happens. We cling to the familiar, and we tend to distrust those who disagree with us, and it's a short hop from there to an opponent, to an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I know you're out of time. I'll just say, I just think we've seen some things in even the past couple of weeks that are disturbing that we haven't seen before. When you look at the president's last rally, where Fox News was, get close to state-run media, in the way Bill Shine was there almost directing backstage. People were being taken out from behind the president who weren't cheering or didn't look enthusiastic enough. I think there's some issues that we all have to just watch because it's unprecedented, some of the things we're seeing there.
Listen, we're going to have more news quiz questions, and I guarantee you a lot more to talk about at our next Week to Week. That's going to take place on Monday, October 22nd. We've got a bit of a lag here between our next one. Thank you to our great panel today, Carla Marinucci, Dan Schnur, and Scott Schaefer. Thanks to all of you here in the room and everyone watching and listening online. Have a great rest of your week.